Imagine waking up one morning and being told that everything you learned about human history is wrong, that the story of civilization, when it began, how it began, and why it began, has been built on a foundation that just cracked open. Not because of a new theory, not because of a computer model, but because a farmer in southeastern Turkey, while walking across a dry, windswept hillside, kicked a strange stone. And what he uncovered would rewrite the textbooks. What archaeologists found beneath that hill would shake every assumption we had about what early humans were capable of. And what Göbekli Tepe revealed to the world is not just a discovery. It is a warning, a wonder, and a mystery all at once. This is not just the story of a site. This is the story of the moment humanity looked at the sky and decided to build something for the gods before it built something for itself. Here is the central question that Göbekli Tepe forces us to ask. What comes first, civilization or religion? For over a century, historians and archaeologists agreed on a clean, logical sequence. First, humans learned to farm. Farming created surplus food. Surplus food created settled communities. Settled communities built cities, and cities, with their leisure time and complex social structures, eventually produced religion, art, and monumental architecture. It made perfect sense. It was rational. It was neat. Göbekli Tepe destroyed every part of that story. Because here, on a hilltop in what is now modern Turkey, people built massive stone temples, organized, intentional, breathtaking, at least 7,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids, and at a time when, according to everything we believed, humans were still simple hunter-gatherers with no agriculture, no cities, and no reason to build anything at all. So what were they doing here? What drove thousands of prehistoric people to drag stones weighing up to 20 tons to the top of a hill and carve them with artwork of astonishing detail? What force was so powerful that it organized human labor on a scale we thought impossible for that era? That is the story of Göbekli Tepe. And once you hear it, to truly understand how shocking Göbekli Tepe is, you need to step back into the world of 11,500 years ago. The last ice age had just ended. Glaciers that once covered vast stretches of Europe and Asia were retreating. The climate was warming. The landscape was transforming. And across what archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent, a sweeping arc of land stretching from modern-day Iraq up through Syria, Lebanon, and down into Jordan and Israel, small bands of humans were moving through the wilderness, hunting animals and gathering wild plants. These were the people we called hunter-gatherers. They were nomadic or semi-nomadic. They followed herds. They camped near water sources. They had fire. They had tools made from flint. They had language and memory and social bonds. But in terms of infrastructure, in terms of organized construction, the prevailing view was simple. They had nothing. They had no permanent settlements because permanence required farming. They had no temples because temples required a priestly class, which required social hierarchy, which required a surplus economy. They had no great monuments because monuments require the organized labor of hundreds, if not thousands, of people over many years. And hunter-gatherers, always moving, always surviving, simply could not afford that kind of collective investment. That was the theory. It was logical, well-supported, and universally accepted. Then came Göbekli Tepe. The hill itself had been noticed before. In the 1960s, archaeologists from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University surveyed the region and noted the site. They saw stone slabs and fragments poking out of the surface, but dismissed them as medieval grave markers. The site was logged, catalogued, and forgotten. Then, in 1994, a Kurdish farmer named Savak Yildiz was working the land near the small town of Orunçik, close to the city of Şanlıurfa in southeastern Turkey. While moving through a field, he struck something hard beneath the thin soil. He brushed it aside. More stone. He dug a little. More still. Word eventually reached a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, who was working in the region at the time. Schmidt came to look, and what he saw made the hair on his arm stand up. These were not medieval grave markers. These were not random rocks. These were precisely carved T-shaped limestone pillars, massive, deliberate, and ancient beyond imagining. Schmidt returned the following year with a proper excavation team. He began digging, and as the layers of soil peeled back, one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites ever found began to emerge from the earth. What they uncovered was a complex of circular stone enclosures, rings of massive T-shaped pillars, many standing between 3 and 6 meters tall, weighing between 10 and 20 tons. The pillars were not rough or crude. They were smoothed, they were shaped, and carved into their surfaces were animals: foxes, boars, cranes, ducks, lions, scorpions, snakes, and vultures, rendered with a level of artistic precision that no one had imagined possible for this period. At the center of each ring stood 2 even larger pillars, like silent sentinels watching over the space. Together, the enclosures formed a ceremonial complex of breathtaking scale, and the entire structure had been deliberately buried, sealed under thousands of tons of soil by the very people who built it, for reasons we still do not fully understand. Klaus Schmidt spent the rest of his life excavating Göbekli Tepe. He died in 2014, with most of the site still underground. Geophysical surveys suggest that only about 5% of the site has been uncovered. What lies beneath the rest of that hill is still largely unknown. Let us talk about the sheer achievement of what was built here, because the scale of it is staggering when you understand the context. The oldest layers of Göbekli Tepe, known as Layer 3, date to approximately 9600 BCE, that is 11600 years ago. To put this in perspective, the oldest written records in human history are from Mesopotamia, dating to around 3400 BCE. The pyramids of Giza were built around 2560 BCE. Stonehenge began construction around 3000 BCE. Göbekli Tepe predates all of them by thousands of years. And yet, the construction here is arguably more impressive than any of them, not in scale, but in what it implies about the people who made it. The limestone pillars were quarried from bedrock outcroppings on the nearby plateau. Some of the unfinished pillars still lie in the quarry, giving us a glimpse of how they were extracted. Workers used flint tools to cut around the stone, undercutting it from the rock face in a process that must have taken enormous time and effort. The largest unfinished pillar in the quarry is estimated to weigh approximately 50 tons. These stones were then moved, without wheels, without metal tools, without draft animals, across the landscape and lifted upright. Experimental archaeologists have calculated that moving a 10-ton pillar using ropes, wooden sledges, and human labor alone would require approximately 500 people working in coordinated teams. 500 people working together for a single stone. And there are hundreds of pillars at Göbekli Tepe. This means that thousands of people gathered here repeatedly over many generations, organized, fed, and directed toward a common purpose. But here's the part that continues to astound researchers. There is no evidence of permanent habitation at the site. No houses, no grain storage pits, no cooking hearths for everyday life. The people who built Göbekli Tepe did not live here. They came here, they gathered here, they worked here, and then they left. It was a place of ceremony, of ritual, of religion, built by people who, by the old textbook definition, were not yet supposed to have any of those things. The implications of Göbekli Tepe began to settle slowly on the academic world, because they were so radical that many scholars initially resisted them. Klaus Schmidt himself was the first to articulate the most disruptive idea. In his famous argument, he proposed that Göbekli Tepe was not built by farmers who had extra time for religion. Instead, he suggested the opposite, that religion came first and farming came second. The theory, developed over years of excavation and analysis, goes something like this. Hunter-gatherers began gathering at this sacred hilltop, drawn together by shared spiritual beliefs, by ritual, and by the act of communal building. And as thousands of people regularly congregated in one place, they faced a logistical challenge. How do you feed that many people for months at a time? The answer, Schmidt argued, was that they began to cultivate wild grasses and domesticate animals in order to sustain the gatherings. In other words, agriculture was not the cause of civilization and religion. It was a byproduct. It was invented to support the sacred. This hypothesis, if correct, overturns the foundational model of human development. It suggests that the spiritual impulse, the urge to worship, to build, to gather in community around something larger than individual survival, is not a luxury of civilization. It is the engine of civilization. Not everyone agrees. Archaeology is a field of careful, contested interpretation, and Göbekli Tepe remains surrounded by debate. Some researchers argue that the site's builders were more settled than previously thought. Others suggest that the relationship between religion and agriculture was more mutually reinforcing than strictly sequential. The conversation is still happening, but everyone agrees on one thing. Göbekli Tepe broke the old model, and nothing in archaeology has been the same since. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Göbekli Tepe is not its size, not its age, not even its architectural complexity. It is the art. The T-shaped pillars at Göbekli Tepe are covered in carvings. Animals are the dominant imagery, and the variety is extraordinary. Foxes with their sharp, cunning faces, wild boars, heavy and dangerous looking, long-necked cranes in mid-stride, scorpions with their tails raised, serpents coiling across the stone, vultures with wings spread wide, lions, aurochs, ducks, and insects, all rendered in bas-relief with surprising naturalism and skill. What is remarkable is not just the quality of the carving, it is the fact that these are not random scribbles or simple symbols. The animals appear in complex arrangements, sometimes interacting with each other, sometimes positioned in ways that seem to carry deliberate meaning. They were placed intentionally on specific parts of the pillars, with the most prominent animals facing outward as if addressing the space of the enclosure. Many researchers believe the animals were not merely decorative. They may have represented spirit beings, clan totems, or mythological entities in a belief system we no longer have access to. Some of the imagery, particularly the vultures and headless human figures, has been linked to possible funerary rituals or beliefs about the afterlife. One of the most intriguing carvings, found on a pillar known as Pillar 43, shows a large vulture apparently holding a round object, which some researchers have interpreted as a severed human head, alongside a scorpion, a crane, and a series of animals in what may be a narrative scene. If so, it would be one of the earliest examples of storytelling in stone ever found. The abstract T-shape of the pillars themselves has also attracted intense scholarly attention. The top of the T corresponds to where a head would be on a human body. The sidearms of the T often have hands or arms carved into them in low relief. The overall form appears to represent a stylized human or human-like being, perhaps a god, a spirit, or a divine ancestor. In other words, Göbekli Tepe may be the oldest temple built not just to worship something, but to stand in the presence of something, to create a space where the divine and the human could meet. Here is the detail that most confuses and captivates researchers to this day. Göbekli Tepe was not abandoned. It was buried. Sometime around 8000 BCE, roughly 1,600 years after the oldest enclosures were built, the site was deliberately filled in. Thousands of cubic meters of soil mixed with flint tools, animal bones, and other debris were deposited over the structures in what appears to have been a purposeful, organized effort to conceal them. The enclosures were sealed, the pillars were covered, the hilltop was smoothed over. This was not the work of erosion, of gradual neglect, of a site simply being forgotten. This was intentional. Someone, a community, a culture, made the conscious decision to bury what their ancestors had built. That question has no definitive answer. Theories abound. Some archaeologists suggest that burying the older enclosures was itself a ritual act, a form of consecration, like the way some cultures enter sacred objects to preserve their power. Others suggest that as the site's function changed over the centuries, older enclosures were sealed to make room for newer ones. Still, others have proposed that the burial was connected to the decline of the culture that built the site, a kind of spiritual act of farewell. What we do know is that the burial is, in a sense, the reason Göbekli Tepe survived at all. The deliberate infill of soil protected the carvings and structures from millennia of weathering and erosion. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe, whatever their reasons, accidentally preserved it for us to find 1,500 years later. There is something deeply moving about that. A culture we cannot name, speaking a language we cannot reconstruct, worshipping beings we cannot identify, made a choice that allowed us to find them. Across the vast gulf of time, they left us a message. We are still trying to read it. The reverberations of Göbekli Tepe have spread far beyond the world of archaeology. The site has fundamentally altered the conversation about human cognitive evolution. If hunter-gatherers could plan, organize, and execute a construction project of this complexity, it also raises new questions about what we call civilization. If Göbekli Tepe represents a sophisticated, organized, symbolically rich culture with no agriculture and no cities, then our definition of civilization needs to be re-examined. We tend to measure civilization by its physical output, cities, writing, metallurgy, but Göbekli Tepe suggests that the interior life of a culture, its beliefs, its rituals, its spiritual imagination, can reach extraordinary heights long before those external markers appear. There is also the matter of what Göbekli Tepe tells us about human cooperation. Bringing thousands of people together across a wide geographic region, sustaining them and channeling their labor toward a shared purpose, that is a feat of social intelligence requiring communication, trust, and shared belief. Those are not the capacities of a primitive mind. They are the capacities of a fully human one. But this was not the end, because what they built would be buried, and what the burial preserved would change our understanding of everything. Göbekli Tepe has also transformed the identity of the region it sits in. Southeastern Turkey, for most of the 20th century, was not a major destination on the world's archaeological map. The region around Şanlıurfa, a city known in ancient times as Urfa or Edessa, and revered by some traditions as the birthplace of Abraham, was historically significant, but not at the scale that draws global attention. Göbekli Tepe changed that entirely. Since excavations began in earnest, the site has been declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It has attracted archaeologists from around the world and generated hundreds of academic papers. Tourism has grown dramatically, with visitors making the journey to stand before the ancient pillars. For Turkey, Göbekli Tepe has become a source of enormous national pride, a symbol of the ancient heritage of Anatolia, and a reminder that this land has been home to human civilization far longer than almost anywhere else on Earth. But the site also carries a broader universal meaning. It belongs not to Turkey or any single nation, but to humanity as a whole. It is a monument built by our common ancestors, people who were biologically identical to us, who thought in symbols and reached toward the divine. When you stand at the edge of an excavated enclosure at Göbekli Tepe, looking down at those ancient pillars still rising from the earth, still carved, still watching, the distance of time collapses. You do not feel like you are looking at the past. You feel like the past is looking back at you. After Klaus Schmidt's death in 2014, excavations at Göbekli Tepe continued under new leadership, with the German Archaeological Institute, Turkish authorities working together to carry the work forward. New discoveries have continued to expand the picture. Excavations have uncovered a large structure known as the Lion Pillar Building, featuring some of the most impressive carvings yet found. New layers have been dated, deepening our understanding of the construction timeline. Isotopic analysis of animal bones has provided clues about the diet and geographic range of the people who gathered here. Perhaps most significantly, geophysical surveys, using ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive technologies, have mapped what lies beneath the unexcavated portions of the hill. The results revealed dozens of additional stone structures and architectural features not yet touched by a trowel. Some appear to be even larger than anything currently exposed. The estimated time needed to fully excavate Göbekli Tepe is measured in decades, perhaps longer. What that means is extraordinary. The most important archaeological discovery of the modern era is still mostly underground. Every year, a little more of it comes back into the light. And every year, what emerges demands that we revise our understanding of how far back the capacity for wonder, for belief, for organized communal purpose truly extends. We began with a question. What comes first, civilization or religion? Göbekli Tepe answers that question not with words, but with stone. At the very dawn of organized human culture, before the first seed was planted in deliberate rows, before the first city rose from the mud of Mesopotamia, before the first king carved his name into a wall, people gathered on a hill in southeastern Turkey, looked at the sky, and decided to build a home for the sacred. They did not do it because they had time to spare. They did it because something in the human mind, something that had been evolving for tens of thousands of years, reached a point where it needed to externalize its interior world, needed to make real, in stone and art and community, the invisible forces it felt moving through the universe. In that act, they were not primitive. They were not proto-humans fumbling toward civilization. They were us. They wondered. They gathered. They built. They buried their work in the earth and walked away. And 10,000 years later, we dug it back up and found ourselves looking at our own reflection across an impossible distance of time. The story of Göbekli Tepe is not finished. The hill still holds its secrets. The geophysical surveys point to structures we have not yet seen. The questions multiply faster than the answers arrive. The builders of Göbekli Tepe reached toward something they could not fully see or understand. They organized thousands of people around a shared invisible belief. They raised monuments of stone in honor of forces they could not prove and could not name. And they sealed it all away, left it as a gift, a puzzle, a message to whoever would come after. We came after. We found it. And now we know that the impulse to ask the great questions, to reach toward something beyond the horizon of the known, is not a modern invention. It is the oldest thing about us. The story is not over. It is just beginning to be told.